Where's Chicago going to find their next stack of cash? Because a bunch of companies are moving out, a bunch of startups are moving out, and a bunch of rich people are moving out. City of Chicago, and then spends $156.2 million on vendors in the migrant crisis so far. This is a lot of money, guys, considering that Chicago, if you check out the south side, there's so many food deserts. There's literally food deserts everywhere. We're also even getting pharmacy deserts where people can't even get their medications unless they drive tens of miles. Opening these stores in impoverished neighborhoods is not on the budget of Chicago, but instead, Chicago will rather spend millions of taxpayer dollars doing the migrant crisis, inviting all these people in with no idea how to house them, because there's almost about 50,000 migrants in Chicago in the past year and a half. Nobody really knows why. In fact, even some of the most hardcore Democrats right now are kind of mad. There's whole neighborhoods in Chicago where like 97% of the voters were all Democratic. They are sick and tired of what the mayor is doing and what's happening to their city. Because some schools are even closing down to make room for migrants. They are not ready for this. And people are really asking, like, why is Chicago doing this? Because you also have Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, setting aside $150 million of budget to care for migrants in 2024. This is less than half the cost of 2023, but it's still enormous. $150 million could be going to a lot of other things like rebuilding the infrastructure of Chicago, cleaning things up, attract tourism, and like I said, making some of the impoverished neighborhoods, the neighborhoods of high crime rates, recover and try to get things back in shape. Chicago is already super crime infested. They have a huge decrease in law enforcement, and there's crime basically everywhere. This is why Chicago has the nickname Chirac for a reason, because they just can't do anything about it. And when you then take out massive amounts of money from the bank of themselves and just put it on the migrant situation, where's this money coming from? You're going to be seeing a lot of cuts to several departments. Okay, maybe the police department, maybe the fireman department. We don't really know what the budget is, but Chicago is not going to be pulling out $150 million this year from thin air. They're going to have to do several cuts here and there and raising taxes, and especially the property taxes, all just to do this migrant situation, which Chicago didn't even have to opt in to do so in the first place. People now are really asking, why is their city doing this? When so many people who live in the city for years are pretty much broke, they live in food deserts, the infrastructure is poor, and the crime rate is sky high. And this is what the Chicago airport looks like, guys. This is crazy. Airports are supposed to be a place for destination and traveling. In fact, if you ask a lot of people who go to Chicago O'Hare, they say that it's basically like a third world country. The city doesn't know where to house these people, so like, okay, let's just house them in these houses here, that warehouse there, and this airport here. There is no cohesion. Like, they just got a bunch of these people in, and then they started thinking about housing and stuff. Now, it would have been okay if Chicago thought of a really good plan to house these migrants, but they didn't, right? They just got them here first and then try to find ways to house them. It should really be the other way around. I mean, if you look at this, Chicago suburb gets desperate, insists residents to take migrants into their homes. So if you look at some of the Chicago suburbs, Brandon Johnson and many other officials in Chicago are like, hey, why don't you take some of these migrants into your house? This is crazy. This isn't even these suburbs' fault, right? Many of these suburban mayors and also governments, like the smaller guys outside of Chicago, they don't want to do this. In fact, Chicago is like, hey man, Illinois, why don't you take up some of the migrants from us, because we don't have the money to do all of this. And then many of the smaller cities here are all like, what? Why'd you say that? And I'm not going to do this migrant crisis when our cities are smaller, we have less money. And many of these cities outside Chicago, they already have a certain budget they got spent a year. They don't have enough money to do this migrant stuff. Not to mention, you're asking everyday citizens to just house a bunch of people in their homes. Some people even say this is crazy. In fact, I kind of agree. And nobody is happy about the situation. And to this day, right now as I'm speaking, Chicago is still getting a bunch of migrants in. But like I said, they just don't know where to house all these people, which is causing a lot of friction right now. Because even, the Democrats are demanding the recall of Chicago mayor as the migrant crisis explodes. They're like, why are you doing this? Why are you getting all these people in? Maybe 5,000 or 10,000 migrants would have been like, okay, right? But when you get up to almost 50,000, it gets to a point where people are like, what, why? Like, what's the whole point of this? Because now everyday residents in Chicago are suffering. They don't like this at all. And every single day, there's more and more buses and vehicles coming in, just dropping migrants off. And people are like, why don't you address some of the issues like this? Like pharmacy deserts where people have to go miles to get the medications and prescriptions. Why not open like a city-owned pharmacy in some of these impoverished neighborhoods where private corporations won't touch? But they're like, nah, just spend another $150 million on the migrant crisis. So people are really frustrated, but let's see what happens to Chicago. The best to them, and hopefully Chicago gets out of this whole entire situation.